I call Mr. Quilty.
Thank you, President. I will be brief. In this bill, change of suppression practices are defined broadly to include both conversations as well as more serious practices. Injurious practices are, rightfully, already illegal. So the effect and the intention of this bill is to restrict what would otherwise be considered non-injurious offences. This bill limits speech that the government does not approve of. The Liberal Democrats have a proud history of fighting for free choice when it comes to gender and sexuality. We call it freedom of thought and freedom of association. But in practice, it means that we believe that you are free to love who you love and to be who you are. We back that 100%, and we always have. We were for marriage equality, and we were for the ability to change the gender on your birth certificate, and we'd support that again. We supported those changes because we believe in personal choice. It's for that same reason that we will be rejecting this legislation. For centuries, classical liberals have argued that people should be free to explore gender and sexuality without government restraint. Views on gender and sexuality have changed rapidly over the past few decades, and it's gratifying to see that members of the Parliament are starting to question the value of punishing alternative views and lifestyles. However, this bill is not an expression of forward-thinking liberal values. It's an expression of arrogance and immaturity. The Victorian government maintained a ban on homosexuality until 1980. And now that this archaic institution has finally made its views just a little bit less backward, it somehow feels it's now at the vanguard of progressive thought. Let me be clear. This bill is not progressive. It is an enforcement of a view of gender and sexuality that is already woefully out of date. To only include lesbian, gay and trans views would have sufficed in the 90s. But we know there is a greater diversity in the LGBTIQA+ community, and each of those groups have their own unique needs and issues they face every day. The bill takes a very narrow binary view of gender and sexuality, and in the process, it erases sections of the LGBTIQA+ community. It is not progressive to ignore consent or good faith in discussing issues of conscience and personal belief. It is not progressive to think your own personal view on gender and sexuality is a view that everybody must hold. It is not progressive to ban discussion about gender or sexuality, and it shouldn't need to be said, but quashing freedom of expression is regressive, and it is a bad thing for all Victorians. It's not progressive to create another blunder of a bill. It shouldn't surprise anyone, least of all those making this legislation. But there are many different views of gender and sexuality held by many different people. This bill is arrogant because it seeks to determine which views are acceptable regarding gender and sexuality. Why should anyone expect this government's view of gender and sexuality is the correct one? A progressive government would recognise that we should be free to hold our own views on this issue. This legislation simultaneously believes that gender transition can have a profound and positive effect on a person's well-being, while also condemning the suggestion that changing your gender may be possible or beneficial. I am not convinced that we've reached the final moral or scientific position on this subject, and this bill risks enshrining a view in law that may, one day, be seen as objectionable and as unjustifiable as the gay bans of 40 years ago. It is a confused and short-sighted bill that forgets every lesson we've learned about liberty in the last 200 years. State intervention in conversations about gender and sexuality is inappropriate. That's the real progressive take. The Liberal Democrats believe in individual liberty, and we wholeheartedly support the right to hold whatever view on gender and sexuality you wish. What it always comes down to, is consent. Adults should always be able to apply informed consent to make choices, whether or not we happen to think those choices are good or bad. The paternalism that infuses this bill is strong enough to choke on. Treating members of minority groups as if they are not mentally capable of forming consent is appalling. We have heard that adults cannot consent because they are unable to stand against the views of their religious congregations. There is a very broad market in different flavours of religion out there. If you belong to a church that will not accept your sexuality, it's time to go shopping for a church that will accept it, that will love you as you are. There are many LGBTIQA+ friendly congregations out there. While we support some of the supposed objectives of this bill, it's poorly written, which in turn will create 4 poorly thought out laws that will be inconsistently applied and interpreted. As usual, this government failed to consult anyone but their own carefully hand-picked groups when drafting this legislation. We consulted very widely on this bill. I'd suggest we consulted more widely than the government did, because the government, knowing they held the high moral ground, didn't feel any need to check their workings. Failure to listen to everybody leads governments to produce bad law. This legislation goes further than any other legislation in Australia, and indeed further than most legislation around the world. We dislike legislation that makes things doubly illegal, as this bill does. We dislike legislation that attempts to enforce particular worldviews at the point of a gun. And we dislike legislation that removes the rights of adults to consent to their own decisions. We reject this legislation.